Welcome to this episode of The Business of Security, and this is a special episode because we're doing it in person, and my guest today is none other than the CEO and founder of TrustMap, Chad Beckman. Chad, thanks for making the trek down here.
Hey Josh, thanks for having me. This is so great to be live in person with you here in your studio.
Well, our topic today is, I think it's a hot one, where a lot of CISOs and security leaders are really starting to explore the idea of process improvement rather than mere compliance or rather than focusing on controls. We hear a lot of security leaders focusing more on process, maybe because it's more aligned to the business, and we can unpack all of that. And so today what we want to talk about is process improvement and control implementation.
Yes.
There's sort of been this false dichotomy between process and controls, and what we found is actually it's both. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about first, what is the intersection and how do these two variables in security, specifically in doing a security assessment, how do those variables intersect and how do they play off of each other?
Yeah. So, everybody is probably familiar with measuring controls. It's all byproduct of achieving compliance and understanding how well you're performing against a set of requirements, right? And so when we look at bringing process into the mix, it begins to look at more than just a control specificity, and it looks more at, I gotta say that again.
Yeah. Say that 10 times fast.
No kidding. But we begin to look at more at just a specific control definition and look at what are the process, the people that help make that control a reality. So, for example, we can look at software inventory as an example control where, somebody in network operations might think software inventory is on a maturity scale of 0 to 5 is a 1. Somebody in the security team is getting reports that looks like everything is fine, and they think it's maybe a maturity level 3 or a 4. And if you were to look at the two viewpoints and the inputs on maturity scale from those two different audience members, you begin to then determine why one person thinks a certain way and the other person thinks another way. So the answer is actually right in the middle. It's probably a 2 to a 3, something like that from a maturity score standpoint. Whereas if you just looked at it from a compliance perspective, compliance is going to give you, yes, we're doing it, or no, we're not. And the answer is probably somewhere in between, perhaps, maybe, not always. But there's more context given when you look at it from a process standpoint. Who's accountable? When we say process, let's break that down for a minute. So, I think most people understand controls, and what controls are a clear definition of achieving a certain outcome, right, based on how that control is defined. A process is another layer that begins to speak to, who's accountable. Is there awareness of this capability? Is there, metrics defined for it? And so we can continually determine if this process is being done effectively or not. And that should all help inform and quantify how well that control is actually performing. There's...
And not the other way around.
And not the other way around, yeah. We don't want to always, we start our assessments with control assessments, right? Measuring the maturity of a control. But then those controls ultimately roll up into processes. And those processes, we could synonymously call them capabilities. Those allow us to actually begin to speak to how we're meeting or helping to enhance outcomes that the business really cares about, right?
Yeah, you don't get a really good conversation from compliance. You get a really good conversation, not just between security people, but you get a conversation between the security function and the other functions of the business when you're focusing on processes, because the business has always understood processes, right? So what are some of the areas that, from an investment standpoint, what are some of the areas that businesses are focused on after taking an assessment? What are some of the variables that influence their investment into processes?
That's a great question. Risk is a big one. So we see customers, when they conduct a maturity assessment, they begin to see gaps. So when I say a gap, everybody has an idea of where they want to be on the maturity scale overall. Maybe it's a 3 or a 4 on a scale of 5. And let's say a control is coming in at a level 2 maturity, and you're trying to get it to a 4. Well, now you know what your gap is, and that helps inform what the risks potentially could be, right? Let's use our previous example of software inventory. Let's say our software inventory came in at maturity level 2. Our goal for this is a 4. And we know that we have some contractual obligations that require us to know what our software inventory is. So there's potential fines related to that. We may have some regulatory commitments as well to understand the assets we have in our under our management, and what data is on those assets. And so there could be some regulatory implications as a result of that. So loss of business could be a potential risk. There could be another risk of regulatory fines, right? Non-compliance. And so being able to understand how well those controls are performing, that roll up into risks, then risks ultimately inform our investments. So if we know if our gap on maturity is we're at a 2, we're trying to get to a 4, we now know then how to improve, what the investment is, what activities specifically that we need to undertake. We need to train more people. We need to enlist our CMDB for our software inventory into other parts of the business that aren't using it currently. There could be an accountability issue. The individuals responsible for software inventory in one division are not the same individuals responsible for it in another division. And so being able to have consistent knowledge of those individual accountabilities is also important. And these are all layers that compliance assessments don't highlight, but they begin to help inform and create a level of confidence once you've gone through this process on a maturity assessment to understand how much visibility and where the improvements need to begin to occur that ultimately inform your investments, both of people resources as well as capital resources.
I'm sitting here thinking that the questions that are coming from the business are probably not going to be control-based questions. I mean, that sounds very obvious. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But if the CEO is coming to a CISO or even a CIO, CTO, and really wants to get some answers about this whole security thing, what are some of the questions that the CEO might ask that, the CISO will have to have those answers for? Does that make sense?
It does. And, that's a loaded question because it's going to be dependent on the context of the business, the size of the business, the industry, a number of different factors. But if we were to generalize a little bit here, let's think about it, the average CEO and the average CISO in any size company, any industry. The example could be simply, I pay you X dollars a year to protect our business in cybersecurity, information security, whatever term is being used at the time. What is our potential for a loss? At the end of the day, a CEO, a CFO for that matter, even a board member, is going to want to know, what's at risk. What are we potentially going to lose? Are we going to impact this brand new large customer negatively, that is important to the business? Do we have potential for that to occur? If so, what is that potential? Do we have, are we going to, perhaps not be able to deliver on some commitments from a performance standpoint? Let's say, you're a e-commerce shop, or, everybody relies on cloud systems at one level or another today. And so, can we determine that those systems are secure and we're not going to end up in some kind of news headline because we received some ransomware, right? And those systems are now unavailable, and we have a PR nightmare to basically navigate. And so those are some of the questions the CEO is going to want to have assurances to. And as a CISO, you need to be able to create those assurances by looking at your environment that is far more detailed than just compliance reports. You need to look at the control performance across different areas of the business, critical areas of the business, of course, identifying what those are, but then also looking at how the people capabilities, the process capabilities are informing those controls and helping to quantify sort of directionally where you truly are.
So how would the SEC rulings coming up in October, they keep pushing it, how would that impact businesses from a process improvement standpoint?
If you're not currently today managing your security posture in a way that allows you to easily report on those outcomes and those criteria that the SEC has defined, then this is a great time to jump in and start looking at maturity and aligning maturity to your business outcomes.
I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but maturity seems to complement more of the oversight requirements of the SEC, specifically being able to demonstrate oversight and how your cybersecurity program is related to risk and how it ties into financial planning and capital allocation.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So, if we were talking a little bit earlier about your maturity assessments, and let's say software inventory was our example. So if you're at a 2 maturity, you're trying to get to a goal of a 3 or a 4, what is your investment required to achieve that outcome, right? And so that's part of what the SEC wants to ensure, that you've got budget allocated for achieving those, you've got it documented, and you've got a roadmap and a timeline to achieve those outcomes. And so it's creating more accountability, just like, right, others in the company that you're working for have accountability for certain processes and controls that support the security posture. The SEC is kind of asking that from an aggregate standpoint of each company now. And being able to do so in a single form, I guess, is what you could call it, instead of trying to bifurcate data from various spreadsheets and to various individuals on an ad hoc basis, is really not going to work as a sustainable solution long term. And that's why we're seeing a lot of leading security leaders begin to take on maturity through a platform type approach that is something that's more repeatable. Data is dynamic, metrics are real time, and they have the financial information that they can not only rely on, but they can also track and update as their environment changes over weeks and months.
Well, this SEC discussion is one that we're going to be having right up until, it comes out, and way beyond, because it's going to be something that is, and it is something that is top of mind in the security world today. And now the businesses are being pulled into it, which is great because we get to have those discussions with the business. Chad, thank you for coming down. I know you've got to go, but where can people find you online?
Yeah, check me out on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/Chad Beckman. You can find my profile there. Also, you can email me directly, chadb@trustsds.com, or if you can spell my last name, it's cbeckman@trustmap.com.